Hello friends, my name is Deepa Shirsat and I'm working as an assistant professor in SNDT College of Arts, Churchgate campus. Today I'm here to discuss with you the introductory, that is the first part of Unit 2. It may be appropriate here to define what a theory is. A theory is a statement or statements of how and why specific facts are related. Skupin and de Courcy define a theory as a set of interconnected hypotheses that offer general explanation for natural or social phenomena. It should also be noted that the terms perspectives and school of thought are often used interchangeably with the term theory. Anthropological theories used to explain human culture, why and how culture work, are similar and different, etc., have been developed since the early years of the discipline. The first anthropological theories that developed in late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe and America include social evolutionism, diffusionism, historical particularism, culture, and personality school and functionalism. Evolutionism assumed the unilinear development of cultures and society from simple, primitive stages to complex civilized stages passing through different levels. Diffusionism stated that culture change occurs due to the borrowing and spread of culture traits from centers of invention to other areas. Historical particularism rejected the unilinear evolution and argued that each culture should be empirically studied in its own historical context, while functionalism focused on culture and society as integrated wholes, where each part in the social structure functioned to maintain order and stability. The conflict school of thought, such as neo-functionalism and Marxist anthropologists, focused on conflict and competition and process of social transformation. Neo-evolutionism or cultural ecology focused on the interaction between culture and ecology and tried to explain cultures as adaptations to specific environment. Studies of cognitive science such as structuralism, ethnoscience, and symbolic anthropology focused on understanding and describing the underlying non-material mental structures that shape cultures. Let us see what functionalism is. This perspective is one of the dominant theories both in socio-cultural anthropology and sociology. The theory regards culture as an integrated whole and tries to explain how the relationships among the parts of society are created and how these parts are functional consequences to the individual and the society. And dysfunctional aspects too are studied. The theory sees society as a complex system whose parts work together to promote solidarity and stability. It states that our social lives are guided by social structure, which are relatively stable patterns of social behavior. Now, let us get ourselves acquainted with what is socio-cultural anthropology is. All social structures contribute to the operation of society. Two dominant British anthropologists in functionalism were Radcliffe Brown and Bronislaw Malinowski, representing two strands in the theory. That is, structural functionalism, which stresses the preeminence of society and its structure over the individuals, and how the various elements of the social structure function to maintain social order and equilibrium. The other part is psychological functionalism, which stresses individual needs to be met by society. The weakness of functionalist theory was that it failed to explain why societies differ or they are similar. Functionalist anthropology assumed an orderly world, paying little or no attention to competition and conflict. The theory was ahistorical, neglecting historical processes. The theory was also unable to explain social and cultural change, as it viewed society as stable and unchanging. Despite these weaknesses, functionalism influenced a great deal of empirical research in anthropology. Functionalists seek to describe the different parts of the society and their relationships through the organic analogy. The organic analogy compared the different parts of a society to the organism or a living organism. That is, the society is compared to the organs of a living organism. The organism was able to live, reproduce, and function through the organized system of its several parts and organs. Like a biological organism, a society was able to maintain its essential processes through the way that the different parts interacted together. Institutions such as religion, kinship, and the economy were the organs, and individuals were the cells in this social organism. Functionalist analyses examine the social significance of phenomena, that is, the function they serve in a particular society in maintaining the whole. Functionalism as a school of thought in anthropology emerged in the early 20th century. Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown had the greatest influence on the development of functionalism from their posts in Great Britain. Functionalism was a reaction to the excesses of the evolutionary and diffusionist theories of the 19th century and the historicism of the early 20th century. Two versions of functionalism developed between 1910 and 1930. That is, Malinowski's biocultural functionalism and structural functionalism. That is, the approach advanced by Radcliffe Brown. Functionalists presented their theoretical and methodological approaches as an attempt to expand socio-cultural inquiry beyond the bounds of the evolutionary conception of social history. The evolutionary approach viewed customs or cultural traits as residual artifacts of cultural history. That is, the evolutionist school postulated that an observed cultural fact was seen not in terms of what it was at the time of observation, but in terms of what it must stand for in reference to what had formerly been the case. By the 1970s, functionalism was declining, but despite its theoretical limitations, functionalism has made important methodological contributions. With its emphasis on intensive fieldwork, functionalism has provided in-depth studies of societies. Additionally, the investigation of functional interrelationships of customs and institutions provide a ready-made framework for the collection of information. Now, let's move towards structuralism, a very important perspective in both anthropology and sociology. Structuralism is one of a new group of theories in anthropology known as studies of cognitive structure. This school of thought, including structuralism, ethnoscience, and symbolic anthropology, gives attention to the cognitive or underlying mental structures that provide order to culture. Structuralism, advanced by its famous French structuralist anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, states that the origin of universal principles that order the ways in which we behave and introduction to socio-cultural anthropology think about the world is to be found in the structure of human thought. The problem with this theory is that they view societies as static and do not help very much in explaining variations among different types of societies. The theory treats culture as a given order and fails to explain the adaptive dimensions of culture. Structuralism developed as a theoretical framework in linguistics by Ferdinand de Saussure in the late 1920s and early 1930s. De Saussure proposed that languages were constructed of hidden rules that practitioners know but are unable to articulate. In other words, though we may all speak the same language, we are not all able to fully articulate the grammatical rules that govern why we arrange words in the order we do. However, we understand these rules of an implicit level, and we are aware when we correctly use these rules when we are able to successfully decode what another person is saying to us. The structuralist paradigm in anthropology suggests that the structure of human thought processes is the same in all cultures, and that these mental processes exist in the form of binary oppositions. Some of these oppositions include hot and cold, male and female, culture and nature, and raw or cooked. Structuralists argue that binary oppositions are reflected in various cultural institutions. Anthropologists may discover underlying thought processes by examining such things as kinship, myth, and language. It is proposed, then, that a hidden reality exists beneath all cultural expressions. Structuralists aim to understand the underlying meaning involved in human thought as expressed in cultural acts. Further, the theoretical approach offered by structuralism emphasizes that elements of culture must be understood in terms of their relationship to the entire system. This notion that the whole is greater than the parts appeals to the Gestalt school of psychology. Essentially, elements of culture are not explanatory in and of themselves, but rather form part of a meaningful system. As an analytical model, structuralism assumes the universality of human thought processes in an effort to explain the deep structure or underlying meaning existing in cultural phenomena. Structuralism is a set of principles for studying the mental superstructure. Now, let us see the contribution of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Father of structuralism, born in Brussels in 1908, Claude Lévi-Strauss obtained a law degree from the University of Paris. He became a professor of sociology at the University of São Paulo in Brazil in 1934. It was at this time that he began to think about human thought cross-culturally and alterity, when he was exposed to various cultures in Brazil. His first publication in anthropology appeared in 1936 and covered the social organization of the Bororo. After World War II, he taught at the New School for Social Research in New York. There he met Roman Jakobson, from whom he took the structural linguistics model and applied its framework to culture. Lévi-Strauss has been noted as singly associated for the elaboration of the structuralist paradigm in anthropology. In the 1940s, he proposed that the proper focus of anthropological investigations was on the underlying patterns of human thought that produce the cultural categories that organize worldview hitherto studied. He believed these processes were not deterministics of culture, but instead operated within culture. His work was heavily influenced by Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss, as well as the Prague School of Structural Linguistics, which include Roman Jakobson and Nikolai Tuberzek-Koy. From the latter, he derived the concept of binary contrasts, later referred to in his work as binary oppositions, which became fundamental in his theory. In 1972, his book Structuralism and Ecology was published, detailing the tenets of what would become structural anthropology. In it, he proposed that culture, like language, is composed of hidden rules that govern the behavior of its practitioners. What made cultures unique and different from one another are the hidden rules participants understood but are unable to articulate. Thus, the goal of structural anthropology is to identify these rules. He maintained that culture is a dialectical process: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Lévi-Strauss proposed a methodological means of discovering these rules through the identification of binary oppositions. Structuralism is an important idea in the history of thought. In the field of anthropology, it was most espoused by Claude Lévi-Strauss, the single most influential anthropologist in the period after Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. Lévi-Strauss's application of linguistic to the cultural was an idea that intrigued British anthropologists like Sir Edmund Leach, Rodney Needham, and Mary Douglas, who were rather bored by what they saw as the increasingly stale structural functionalism of British social anthropology. Key themes and features reappear in structuralist analysis and are worth exploring. One of the prime ideas of structuralism is the idea of culture being a kind of language, and was inspired by the work of the structural linguistics, particularly Jakobson and Saussure. Saussure had called for a science that studies the life of science within society, thus creating semiology, or the study of science. Lévi-Strauss believed Saussure and Jacobson's synchronic analysis was not merely limited to language, it could be applied to kinship as well, and all the rest of cultural life, as had been revealed in part by the, again, a historical functionalist field workers. In structural anthropology, he argued that kinship was like a phonemic system, built in the mind, thereby borrowing the linguistic analysis of Saussure and others for his intellectual project. Inspired by Saussure, he also had a great power to strip through the adiaphora and superficial to find what he argued were the elementary patterns of human existence. This was inspired by Saussure's distinction between deep language and more superficial parole. Lévi-Strauss wanted to experience the deepest plane of thought he could arrive at, though it must be noted that not all anthropologists were that enthusiastic by Lévi-Strauss's search for universal patterns of thought. This tension between the universalist and particularist was explored in The Savage Mind, but no firm conclusion was made. The linguistic turn of Claude Lévi-Strauss and his followers is particularly interesting as a paradigm shift akin to the similar one in philosophy. Furthermore, Leach's battle with Gluckman looks like a war between the sociological preoccupations of structural functionalism and the linguistics of structuralism. The study of signs or semiotics was another crucial feature of structuralism. In France, semiotician Roland Barthes lit up the intellectual scene at the similar time as Lévi-Strauss, and it is important to view him as part of this structuralist milieu. But Lévi-Strauss also looked beyond merely describing signs and looked to explore the relationships between them. As Woodward argues, green is not green because it is green, rather it is green because it is not blue or red. It is relationally patterned. The idea of there being a system of relational differences fascinated Lévi-Strauss. Inspired by Durkheim, Lévi-Strauss was dedicated to probing this system of meaning as best as he could. His fascination with structure was psychological in nature in that there was some kind of unconscious infrastructure to be explored rather than the social block one expects from the structural functionalists. He wanted to map the principles for the functioning of the mind. Kinship's cause seemed to stem from the mind, and Leach firmly believed that mind was the only human constant factor. The rationality of the primitive man is addressed, and Lévi-Strauss comes to an interesting conclusion regarding the savage mind. For Lévi-Strauss, who did his fieldwork in Brazil only briefly, the emic viewpoint is very important. The myriad of often quite complex classifications that a mind of the savage makes are inherently valuable. Lévi-Strauss calls this the science of the concrete. Connected to the science of the concrete is one ideal type of thoughts that Lévi-Strauss formulated. The Brie-Collier was originally seen by Lévi-Strauss as an intellectual strategy of getting by in life. The Brie-Collier has since been extended in the field of material culture studies to mean a tinkerer who solves material problems or who creates new structures. Woodward uses an effective ethnographic account of the aboriginal mechanic in the outback who uses branches and bush debris to fix his car. It shows how a slight reconceptualization of Lévi-Strauss can have something still to say to contemporary social anthropologists. Lévi-Strauss was also fascinated by mythology across the America. Leach was the lone follower, according to Cooper, in this particular enterprise. His mythologics area toured their force of his deep knowledge of ethnographic data, which it could be argued makes up for his less than tireless fieldwork. Leach and Lévi-Strauss describe how tropes reappear in a local context. Lévi-Strauss, however, should not take all the praise or blame. Leach was an interesting theorist in his own right, particularly with his amalgamated synthesis of Malinowskian functionalism and French structuralism. In the field of kinship, Leach applied the structuralist stress on reciprocity and moss to his Southeast Asian work, running utterly counter to the prevailing theories of Fortes and others. One aspect never completely taken to its conclusion is shown in the following quote: "By thinking of the organizational ideas that are present in any society as constituting a mathematical pattern." A mathematical as well as linguistic approach to culture is an interesting idea, as humans demonstrably work with numbers, without it necessarily becoming just a repeat of economic anthropology's formalism. It would be interesting if the ecometric models found in modern economics could have some anthropological counterpart as well, though this is not what Leach is entirely suggesting. He is as much trying to explain the old linguistic hallmarks of structuralism as a systemic pattern of code in a slightly new way. Mary Douglas, in one essay in The Structural Study of Myth and Totemism, shows how far this more mathematical structuralism can in fact go, taking the linguistic into the realm of abstract algebra. Another abiding fascination of Lévi-Strauss was incest. He saw exogamy as the beginning of culture, as it is the first rule to check natural impulses. Indeed, to return to the linguistic analogy, women or wives are messages, and their exchange is at the basis of social life. Everything goes back to the overarching but internal mental structures of kinship infrastructure. Another key approach of structuralism is its academic lineage. Durkheim's influence is shown in the idea of elementary forms in both him and Lévi-Strauss's books. Leach claims the influence of German idealism as he presents himself as a dialectical reaction to functionalism. Mary Douglas further expounds the dialectical model when she shows how Hegel influenced the aforementioned dyadic arrangement of thesis and antithesis. But in the work of Levi-Strauss, there is no synthesis, which is always a little disappointing from a Marxist viewpoint, even if he claims they're clothes at times. One final feature that can be observed about structuralism is how it was embraced by a generation of intellectuals both in France and Britain, and then was jettisoned subsequently. Roland Barthes moved on to post-structuralism, where he began to inspire anthropologists and cultural studies students. Michael Foucault, who started out in medical anthropology, too went on to postmodernist thought, which began to question the sureties of structuralism. Pierre Bourdieu, sociologist and anthropologist, followed a more personal trajectory but moved away from structuralism and towards practice theory. Furthermore, a challenge came from out with structuralism from Jacques Derrida's deconstructionism, which simply put challenges some of the hallmarks of structuralism, such as the dyadic dualism or opposition. Therefore, in conclusion, it can be said that structuralism is a very distinctive anthropological method as much as a theory. It includes language as a model, relations over essence, the controversy of Captain Cook, deep rules and principles with psychology, the brioclore, a fascination of with along with incest, dichotomous opposition, Leach's more mathematical turn, the influence of past thought, and finally, the intellectual drift to post-structuralism and postmodernism. It can be complex and very simple at the same time. These are the features of structuralism in anthropology. Now, let us see Sir Edmund Leach's contribution to structuralism. Edmund Leach was very influential in social anthropology. Sir Edmund Leach was one of Britain's foremost social and cultural anthropologists and a man of extraordinary versatility, originality, and intellectual breadth. His substantial contributions to anthropology deals with topics including kinship and social organization, hill tribes and valley people, tenure and peasant economy, aesthetics, British structural functional methodology, the structuralism of Levi-Strauss, biblical narratives, and the myths of classical Greece. Leach was not wedded to any settled orthodoxy. What makes his work exciting is his experimentation with new ideas and his expansion of the horizons of the discipline. His distinctive view of the comparative method allows him to transcend the stale dichotomy between them primitives and us moderns, finding instead a dialectical between us and them, which opens up the possibility for illuminating common human propensities and capacities. He demonstrated the complex interrelationship of ideal models and political action within a historical context. His most influential ethnographic works were based on fieldwork in Burma, Sarawak, and North Borneo, and Sri Lanka as well. Although his initial theoretical approach was functionalist, Leach then shifted to processual analysis. Leach was later influenced by Claude Lévi-Strauss and adopted a structuralist approach. Structuralism has influenced thinking not only in France, Britain too has been receptive. But the British structuralists such as Edmund Leach, Rodney Needham and Mary Douglas do not follow Lévi-Strauss in looking for pan-human or universal principles in the human mind. Rather, they concentrate on applying structural analysis to particular societies and particular social institutions. Leach is perhaps best known for Political Systems of Highland Burma, a study of Cochin social structure. Like Malinowski's unforeseen internship in the Trobriand Islands during World War I, Leach's military service in Burma during World War II inadvertently facilitated his breaking loose from the anthropological model of intensive fieldwork in a single community, with limited generalization to larger units. During the war, Leach travelled widely throughout Kachin country, obtaining a unique overview of the range of intra-cultural variation, particularly in relation to the Shan Valley peoples. Furthermore, his notes were lost twice, and the resulting ethnography was written from memory and subsequent archival research. Leach was thus forced to write a more sociological, historical, and theoretical book than he doubtless envisioned at the start of his research. Leach identified two contrasting, ideal types of political organization. These are Gumlao and Gumza, which alternated historically between egalitarian and hierarchical modes. This approach combined with more traditional participant observation fieldwork in a single community. It demonstrated that anthropologists could move beyond ethnography. Pul Elia, a village in Ceylon, provided a meticulous cataloguing of land tenure holdings in relation to kinship systems. Leach approached the ideal system on which individual and kin group strategies were based through interpretation of exhaustive statistical information on particular local arrangements. He helped move social theory from descent group to alliance theory. The socio-religious feudal structure of the Kandayan king-dominate demand, its hierarchy of castes emerged from the social order implicit in these quantitative patterns. This is the most empirical and detailed analysis of Leach's major works, but does not entirely omit his characteristic concern with how members of the culture construct their thought and worlds. Leach was perhaps the most important British interpreter of the structuralism of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Leach's version of structuralism critiqued the French anthropologist's analysis of Burmese kinship data. More importantly, however, Leach insisted on an empirical basis for structuralist generalizations, rejecting Lévi-Strauss's emphasis on universal properties of the human mind and insisting that similarities of pattern across cultures be understood in ethnographic context as well as through species biology. In conclusion, we may say that functionalism in social science looks for the part, that is the function, that some aspect of culture or social life plays in maintaining a cultural system. There are two quite different schools of functionalism, and these are Malinowski's version of functionalism, which assumes that all cultural traits serve the needs of individuals in a society. And the second school is Radcliffe Brown's, who felt that the various aspects of social behavior maintain a society's social structure rather than satisfying individual needs. Claude Lévi-Strauss has been the leading proponent of structuralism. Lévi-Strauss sees culture as it is expressed in art, ritual, and the patterns of daily life, as a surface representation of the underlying patterns of the human mind. Whereas Lévi-Strauss's structuralist approach involves intuitively grasping the rules of thought that may underlie a given culture. An ethnographic approach known as ethnoscience attempts to derive these rules from a logical analysis of data, particularly the words people use to describe their activities. In this way, ethnoscientists try to formulate the rules that generate acceptable behavior in a given culture.